Okay, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining today's Critical Issues Forum Speaker Series. And good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm pretty sure that more people are joining soon, but I can tell this is a very international group. Just with this small group, I see participants from Japan, Canada, and some different places. So my name is Masako Toki. I'm a senior project manager for the Nonproliferation Education Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. So thank you so much for joining today's exciting event. So let me share my screen. Okay, so you're seeing my screen? Good. So today I am so excited to have amazing speakers for this event with the theme of Decolonizing Nuclear Studies, the project of the highly enriched. Today's speakers are Dr. Anne Harrington and Professor Shampa Biswas, and I'm going to introduce them to you in a bit. I believe that this topic, decolonizing nuclear studies, is very timely when the nuclear threat is increasing. So we need to engage more people, especially younger generations, in nuclear discussion. So this decolonizing nuclear studies project is an excellent way to engage more diverse group of audiences. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, okay. So we need more younger generations to discuss nuclear issues. And so before I talk about going to the introduction, let me briefly introduce our school and our project and Critical Issues Forum, just very briefly. So first, let me briefly talk about our school, which is also my alma mater, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. So we are here in Monterey, California, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I think everybody agrees to this aspect. And our school provides international and professional education in areas of critical importance to a rapidly changing world. And our school's mission states, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies educates professionals to advance understanding, promote peace, and drive change in pursuit of a more just world. Please visit our school's website if you are interested in learning more about our school. And I work at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, a research center of the Middlebury Institute. Our center was established in 1989 by Dr. William Potter. The mission of our center is to combat the spread of weapons of mass destruction by training the next generation of nonproliferation specialists. We have a variety of research and education and training programs. The Critical Issues Forum project is one of CNS's flagship nonproliferation education projects to promote disarmament and nonproliferation for high school students around the world. CIF project goals include to help students appreciate different national and cultural perspectives on complex international security issues and contribute to international peace and security, disarmament, and nonproliferation, and other social justice endeavors, while developing their critical thinking and intercultural communication skills. Normally, the CIF project conducts an in-person student conference in Monterey, California, where our school is located. In the past, we also had a conference in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan and Vienna, Austria. Student representatives from each CIF high school present their semester-long studies at the spring conference. We also invited amazing guest speakers for the student conference. So each year, we select a timely topic related to nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation. So these are also some photos from recent conference. And this year, we are going to have a spring student conference on April 5th and 6th in Monterey with a diverse group of high schools from around the United States and Japan. This year's topic is Advancing Nuclear Disarmament and Nonproliferation through Youth Education. So we are so excited about this conference. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres states, more education and training opportunities should be established in order to empower young people to be a force for change and disarmament. If you are high school teachers or students and interested in learning more about the Critical Issues Forum or interested in joining the program, please reach out to me. You can find the information about the CIF on our website, and please follow us on the social media, especially Instagram, as we are actively posting educational information. I also want to mention that some of CIF alumni decided to continue to study nonproliferation and disarmament and decided to study at our graduate school. So if you are interested in our school or CNS, our center, please also contact us. So finally, CIF activities cannot be possible without generous support from our donors and friends. I'd like to express our sincere appreciation to the funders and supporters of the Critical Issues Forum project, the Tom and Sarah Pattison Fund, the Saga Foundation, the Catherine Wasmore Davis Conflict Transformation Collaborative Fund, and Mr. Greg Warpert. Thank you so much for all of your support, and thank you so much for your attention. So now, let me introduce today's amazing speakers. Okay, so let me introduce Professor Shampa Biswas. So Professor Shampa Biswas is a judge and Mrs. Timothy A. Paul Chair of Political Science at Witman College. She is a post-colonial international relations theorist whose work examines the inequality of the nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament regime. She is the author of Nuclear Desire, Power and the Post-Colonial Nuclear Order. She is currently working on a project on nuclear memorialization and the global story of Fatima. Dr. Anne Harrington is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cardiff University, Wales, in the United Kingdom, where she teaches on nuclear strategy and nonproliferation, war and society, and diversity and inclusion in global politics. She is the co-founder and project director of the HIGHLY NRICHED, and earned her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 2010. Since then, she has held fellowships at major universities in the United States and Europe, including the one at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at Middlebury Institute. So we are so happy to have Anne as well, of course. Okay, so now we are going to move to today's keynote speakers presentation. And I understand Professor Shampa Biswas is going to be the first speaker. So please take it away, Shampa.
Thank you. And thank you, Masako, for this invitation. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So I'm going to get us started with just thinking about this project, the broad contours of this project, which we called the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies. So Anne and I were the co-leads on this, but we did this work in collaboration with 11 other colleagues at various universities in the US and the UK. So this really is a truly collaborative project. The project itself sits on the platform of Highly Enriched, and Anne will talk more about Highly Enriched in a little bit. What I'm going to do today is mostly talk about the project of Decolonizing Nuclear Studies, why we decided to take this on, what it means, and then give us a little feel for the website. And then Anne will talk more about Highly Enriched, and perhaps if you have time, talk about one particular activity from the various resources we have created on this. Okay, so why decolonize nuclear studies? What does that mean? So I want to begin by saying that academic change happens very, very slowly. It is, and there are all kinds of reasons for this. This is true both of the curriculum that we cover in our courses, as well as pedagogy, the ways that we teach. In part, that is because getting a PhD takes a lot of time and resources and training within a discipline. And the incentive structure of academia is such that you end up reproducing. It tends to be, I would say, kind of conservative in that even when you're innovating basically within the larger parameters of the discipline. It's rare for you to be able to question the basic foundations of the discipline and get published in reputable places, right? Which is what you need in order to be able to advance in the field. Even when there's change, there's new scholarship emerging, it takes a lot longer for that scholarship to make it into syllabi. So teaching change happens even slower than scholarly change. And that's because changing the curriculum requires agreement amongst sometimes very disagreeable people. What has made change possible really is outside pressure and outside pressure from young people. So the 1960s and 1970s were one of those times when there was a lot of pressure on academic institutions in light of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and of course, connected to both of those, student protests that emerged around campuses in the United States, but also in Europe. These are the programs, these kind of pressures, this kind of advocacy and activism led to the generation of new programs of studies, such as programs in race and ethnic studies, programs in feminist studies or gender studies. All of those came out of student activism on college campuses demanding change, right? And they did produce significant changes. These programs, these new programs, yielded new ways of understanding the world, looking at the world, gave us new tools. The reason that we now talk about structural racism and patriarchy as a structural force is because of the really cutting edge work that happened in those kinds of spaces. In the last couple of years, there has been, but one result of this was because these were new programs of study, they kind of insulated existing disciplines from really creating much change. So disciplines like history, political science, English, philosophy, they kind of became insulated because much of this work that was happening in these new programs of study that were created across campuses. The last couple of decades have seen new kinds of pressures, and this has come in the form of calls to decolonizing our disciplines. So, of course, starting with the anti-globalization protests that emerged in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the Roads Must Fall campaigns that started in South Africa, but then spread all over Europe. And of course, the Black Lives Movement protests that started in the US, but then also got globalized, got taken up in a lot of different contexts around the world. So these were the kinds of these pressures started showing up on academic campuses as well. Students began demanding changes in our curriculum, changes in the disciplines, but there were also inside pressures that were emerging because newer scholars who had come of age since the 1960s and 1970s were bringing insights from race and ethnic studies, from gender studies, from feminist studies into the existing disciplines. And this is what really sort of pushed towards the demand to decolonize our curriculum and our institutions, right? And the insight is really quite obvious that if the world has been shaped by colonialism, racism, misogyny, of course, our disciplines have been as well, right? So it seems to us that many departments have been really struggling with this. Many departments have made actually pretty transformative changes in their syllabi, have really grappled with this question of what it means to decolonize their disciplines. But nuclear studies in general seems to us to have been much more recalcitrant to this, has been much more resistant to incorporating those kinds of changes. And I'm talking about nuclear studies in sort of a narrow way here. There are, of course, scholars in all kinds of fields, such as anthropology, cultural studies, science and technology studies, who have been thinking about gender, race, colonialism as they apply to the nuclear weapons world. But those insights, that scholarship, that thinking has been largely peripheral to this field that we are calling the nuclear studies field or the nuclear security studies field, which is the field which largely generates either policymakers or experts who have the ears of policymakers, right? There are two different ways of getting into the nuclear policymaking field, it seems. One is through becoming a scientist, and I think scientists are much more open to questions of disarmament than the other way, which is through the security studies field. And that field to us seems to be still pretty conventional. So a standard, and this here I'm caricaturing a little bit, a standard nuclear studies syllabus looks something like this. You begin with the Manhattan Project, which is talking about the making of the bomb. You then move on to talking about deterrence or the managing of the bomb. In fact, spending a lot of time on the logic of deterrence, how it works, the conditions that you require for it to work or not work. And then a significant amount of time, perhaps at the end, talking about proliferation, which is about preventing the bomb spread to other actors, right? And largely non-Western actors. By the time you finish with this syllabus, you have kind of forgotten, right, that the US has, for instance, the US has 3,000 plus nuclear weapons. You haven't really thought much about the nuclear production chain, which begins with uranium mining, the long legacy of nuclear testing and its harmful effects. So there's very little sort of grappling with those kinds of questions. And by the time you finish this syllabus, you're really not thinking very much about disarmament as a real intellectual and political project, especially disarming the nuclear weapon states. So the case that we made to the Plowshares Fund, which is where we got funding for this project, was that for disarmament to become a real possibility, we have to change the way young people who are tomorrow's policymakers are educated. We need to transform this field. And it was our sense that younger scholars in the field, new PhDs, were very much interested in changing the field, in bringing new insights into the field, but they were not always sure where to begin, in part because of their former training. It was harder to conceptualize new ways of teaching this material. So the project that we took on was creating teaching resources, both content and pedagogy, that educators could take and integrate into the syllabi, right? Not just add at the very end, but make it central to the syllabi. So to create curriculum that can really push against the normalization of nukes, right? Against the normalization of nuclear weapons. Okay, so so this became the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies project. This is the link to the project, and there is a URL here, which you can use to go to the site, which is live now. And I'm going to very quickly walk us through the basic structure of the project. So this is the landing page, and there's a little description, and it has some course definitions. It has a very long reading list, which we will constantly be updating. The project has 3 different modules, and you see those at the very top right: feminism, race, and more than human. Each of the modules are connected. We made intersectionality, thinking across race, colonialism, gender, sexuality, disability together, sort of part of the project. Each of the modules contains a variety of teaching resources. So they have lecture notes, they have videos, they have all kinds of classroom exercises that instructors can use in their classes. What we also tried to do, and this was kind of challenging for us, was to challenged ourselves to visualize a style that best represents the content that we want to convey, to really think about form in addition to substance. And as I click on these different links, I hope some of that will become clear. So part of the challenge we gave ourselves was that students learn not just at the cognitive register, right? Not just with their heads, but also through different kind of feelings that different materials produce, also at the affective register. They're moved by certain things, right? You feel with your bodies as well. So each module has a different visual feel in part, and the visual feel is designed to convey the content that the module builders wanted to convey. So for instance, feminism, this is the feminism module page. As I move through this, you can see that there is this, my cursor becomes a torch. And the part of this was to show that feminism illuminates different parts of the nuclear world. It brings to light different parts of the nuclear world. So it helps us think of expertise differently. It brings attention to different kinds of bodies that are damaged by nuclear weapons production and use, different kinds of homes. And each of these, if you click on these, they will take you to a whole bunch of other resources. This is the module on race. And you'll see, this is the design of this is it's called a parallax design. As I go down, you'll see two parallel. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a behind that stays constant, and there's movement in the front. And the idea is to convey that even though there was knowledge about nuclear weapons that was produced by great powers, which is basically the knowledge that we get in a conventional nuclear studies syllabus, there was in tandem, in parallel, all kinds of knowledges that were emerging from places that were peripheral to the great powers, right? It covers folks at the 1955 Bandung conference, at which leaders from Africa and Asia were talking about disarmament. There is a discussion about Iraq. There's a discussion about Iran, and there is a discussion about Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. So the final one is the More Than Human module, and this is the module that takes the environmental impacts, the ecological impacts of nuclear weapons seriously. If you can see the design of this is, these are islands, and that is honoring the fact that most of nuclear testing happened in the Pacific on areas that were peripheral to mainlands, right? And that the environment lives, which is why you see this moving. There are 4 nodes of this: circuitry, conservation, contamination, and contestation. And each of these, again, takes you to different resources. So I'm going to stop there and hand over the microphone to Anne.
Thank you, Shampa, for that excellent overview of this project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, not so much from its intellectual origins, but just some of the practical pieces of it. The project of Decolonizing Nuclear Studies was born out of, in part, this collaboration between Shampa and I about the importance of this, and sort of responding to this demand, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, for alternative types of resources. How do we tell the stories that are not often told, or that get left out of the great power narrative about nuclear issues? But there was another piece to this, which was in 2018, I co-founded an online resource with 5 other people all of whom work in the think tank or the United States Department of Defense or otherwise in some way connected to the nuclear enterprise. And we had this idea that there are all of these resources that are out there, but they're really hard to find unless you spend all of your time developing expertise and kind of where to find them, right? That you have a familiarity with this expert world. And so one of the ideas was that we could crowdsource a lot of these things by bringing them into one central place. And Decolonizing Nuclear Studies was the first time that we also thought, well, we don't want to reinvent the wheel when it comes to creating resources for nuclear education on nuclear issues. But when we see a hole or a need for resources that don't yet exist, we want to make all of the things that we have learned over the past 5 years, 6 years now, I guess, on in terms of how to bring these things online, how to marry design with educational resources, how to do all of that. We want to make those resources available to projects like Decolonizing Nuclear Studies. So Decolonizing Nuclear Studies is a project of Highly Enriched in the sense that we provide an online home for it, and that it was our relationships with web designers and graphic designers that supported the production of the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies materials. So it lives online, and it has a couple, the Highly Enriched ecosystem, it has a couple of features. The thing that I wanted to highlight for this group is that in addition to having, anyone can go online and make an account. If you are a nuclear expert or educator, you can make a contributor or a mentor account. If you're a student, you can make a general account. But one of the things that is freely available are not only resources that can be downloaded for use in an educational context, but there's also a lot of informational interviews that we've done with contributors and mentors about how they got into the field. So I'll give you a little story about a use case that Shampa knows about. Shampa had a student of a colleague who was going to interview for a fellowship at a major think tank, and she was looking for ways to prepare for it. Well, we had informational interviews with some of the people that she would be interviewing at this think tank with online, right? So when they went to prepare for this job interview, they were able to go watch these informational interviews with the mentor. You can also contact these people through the site. So that's useful for educators who want to contact people maybe to give subject matter experts to give a talk on a particular topic in their classroom. So I frequently have guests into my class who worked at, for instance, the International Atomic Energy Agency to talk a little bit about the historic events they were part of, or what they do in terms of inspections there. So all of those resources are there. And we decided we wanted to take on this project of partnering with Shampa in order to create these online curricula and exercises that would in particular support the project of Decolonizing Nuclear Studies. Because part of what the Highly Enriched project is about taking what might be a network and resources that might be not widely shared and widely available, and making this much more, democratizing it by making it more widely available to people that may not have personal access to it, right? So the DNS project is very much in line with the overall mission of Highly Enriched. And I thought what we could spend a little bit of time doing maybe is just going through an example of one of the exercises. Some of the exercises are more involved in the sense that they're really something that require a classroom environment because they're built to do readings ahead of time and then do an activity together with discussion. I picked one from the Feminism in the Nuclear World module because it's something that's easy to adapt to this kind of environment. And when you go online you navigate through the site, and then most of these activities are PDF format that you can download. Many of them are still designed to be used through a computer. So I've already downloaded this, so I'm not going to walk through this on Highly Enriched of how you download. But I've already downloaded the PDF for this particular activity. And this activity is about getting you to think more carefully about how you evaluate what constitutes expertise. So it's called The Sounds of Nuclear Expertise, and it's in the expertise subsection. And it has pre-readings that are associated with it for a classroom environment setting. But the heart of this particular exercise is that you listen to different people talking, and then you think about what do you notice when they talk. So we're not going to listen to all 5 audio clips. We're only going to listen to a couple of them. But while you listen, pay attention to all the characteristics of the clip that influence your opinion of the speaker and the content. For example, the gender of the speaker, their voice, their tone, their language, what they're speaking about. So I've already downloaded these. These, if you click in the center of them, it opens up the clips. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes and we're going to play 2 of them.
As quickly as possible. To make a long story short, that's what I did in the darkness. By the time I came out of the building, no, there wasn't a building, the rubble, I should say. The rubbles were on fire. I looked back and thought about my girlfriends in there in the same room. But no way I could go back into the flame. So that meant about 30 other girls who were with me in the same room were all burned to death alive. I looked around. Although it happened in the morning, it was dark, perhaps because of the smoke and soot and the particle in the air, which was rising in the mushroom cloud. So it took me some while before my eyes got adjusted. Then I began to see some moving dark object approaching to me. And finally, I figured out they were injured people desperately shuffling from the center of the city to the outskirts. The man said, soldier said, well, you girls, I and 2 other girls, you girls joined that procession and escaped to the nearby hill. That's what we did. And we learned how to step over the dead bodies. And we managed to escape. At the foot of the hill, there was a huge military training ground, about the size of 2 football fields. Quite a big place. By the time I got there, the place was packed with the dead bodies and dying people. Some grown, but mostly begging voices, very faint voices. What?
Okay, so that's the first clip. And just make note of what you notice about the speaker. Make note of also what's happening for you as you listen to the speaker. And now we're going to listen to a different kind of clip.
And he's developed a military strategy that involves, quote, nuclear scalpels for every military problem in Europe, end quote, that might be employed on a limited basis to, quote, sober, but not enrage his enemies. And of course, we've been shaken in our thinking about deterrence of Russia by the miscalculations that President Putin has made over Ukraine. Secondly, China. Of course, in the 1990s, China was an afterthought in the nuclear discussion. China was a country with 20 nuclear-tipped missiles capable of reaching the United States. It had a no first use policy, wasn't spending much money on modernization. And the political relationship between China and the West seemed to be more or less headed in the right direction, albeit slowly. And of course, in today's world, Presidents Xi and Putin see eye to eye about the problems presented to them by the world order dominated by the United States. And apparently, Mr. President Xi has had a change of heart about nuclear weapons because he's pursued the largest peacetime buildup of nuclear weapons by China. It's a buildup, it's a modernization, it's a diversification, building new types of weapons for different roles. And of course, we don't know what role these might play in a conflict over Taiwan. And we don't know what President Xi might consider to be enough nuclear weapons. We hope that all he's motivated by is a sprint to parity, but he's also talked about developing a military posture consistent with China's place at the center of the world stage in the dominant position.
Okay. So now, once you go through and listen to these clips, their exercise includes discussion prompts. So I'm going to read some of these questions to you, and I want to invite you to put comments in the chat for people if you would like to. And we're also going to have a little bit of a discussion about the clips. So which of the clips stands out as most rational and authoritative to you, and why? Were you paying more attention to the content of the clip as you were listening, or how the speakers conveyed that content? Was there something you found particularly strong in one of the clips? If so, what was it? Were there elements that you did not like about any of the clips that we listened to? I'm going to stop there because the subsequent questions presume that you've done some of the readings. So I think we can just let people take a minute to think about this. And like I said, we can type in the chat box, depending on we're kind of a small group of participants here, so we can probably also just do some discussion if people are more comfortable doing that. But I think we can just sort of hang out for a sec while people think about this. And I feel like if we have enough time, what we'll do is participate in this exercise for a little bit, and then afterwards we can open up to broader questions. And I'm also going to invite Alyssa or Hallie if they want to, start off the discussion and moderate it. I will mute myself for a little while and hand things over to you.
So I guess I'll start. The first clip obviously has a lot more firsthand experience with the effects of nuclear weapons, and it's a lot more emotional, whereas the second speaker was detached and didn't really consider on the human level the effect that nuclear weapons have, and it wasn't as detailed and knowledgeable as the first speaker.
Do people feel that one type of experience, I think you explained them very well, one type of experience conveys a higher level of expertise than the other.
Yeah, we have some answers from the audience in the chat as well. As David Newman says that the clip 1 is very moving and it's from an actual survivor, and they have a strong impact, and it is a female trust. Clip 2 is from somebody from the military, arms race, and not sorry, I cannot read the last part. And then I think Fernando said that for question 1, or it is rational and authoritative. The second clip talks about strategy and posture and deterrence, and it sounds very masculine and strong, which I also agree with as well.
Yeah, I agree to both comments, and I just I must confess that the first voice is very familiar to me, and I have heard many times her experience. So when I listen to her voice, first thing came to my mind is her face and atmosphere. So maybe it's a little bit different, but I just feel whenever you share your real experience, and also when you have a very strong emotion, and really this speech's whole purpose is to touch someone's heart, that really have a very powerful impact, in my view, in my opinion. So that's why I listen to atomic bombing survivors, mainly female survivors, because they usually live longer. So I have a very similar feeling whenever I hear those female voices of atomic bombing survivors. Yeah.
I find them the experience of thinking about expertise in this framework, it's a little bit paradoxical in the sense that, like you said, Misako, listening to the first clip, it was hard for me not to tear up. And it's an experience that's personal, and yet generalizable to anyone who lives through a nuclear catastrophe, will tell some version of this horrific story. And yet there's something about the fact that because it does touch you emotionally, it interacts with, I had so many experiences in my body, whereas the second clip, I really didn't have any emotional experience, or at least not one that I noticed. I mostly just was listening in this kind of like cognitive way, right? Which is usually the part of my brain that I associate with expertise, right? With this kind of analytical piece, that was the part that was doing the processing, even though those kind of like credibility of the firsthand experience is a much more potent form of expertise. It feels like a kind of paradox, because my experience of listening to the other one is an experience of what my stereotype of an expert is.
So Fernando continues to say, it's sad to realize that the first clip is not something we would commonly associate with expertise, in spite of how rich and generalizable it is. And at my school, we don't really hear from survivors. So that's also a sad part of academia. and it should definitely be more inclusive.
Can I also join the discussion? My grandmother is also a survivor, and she's 84 years old. So like when she was 6 years old, she exposed to the atomic bomb, and now she's still alive and healthy, but she can't speak English that well. So it's really like, how can I say, the people who survived and who speak English that well, it's really like rare and very powerful to the international society, I guess. And for the second speaker, the male speaker, I thought like I remind me like a Eichmann of the how can I say, the German military, and he said like when he is on the court, say like, I just follow the order of his boss or his like military. So like it's really, his order is really seems very cruel, but at the same time, it's kind of very systematic in the war situation, and it's very apart from the civilians who are survived from the were and the victims. Yeah.
Another comment says the second clip is focused on competition between world dominators, and it shows the challenge of nation-state competition in an unjust world order. It shows expertise in technical and geopolitical and not in global humanity. It's more focused about winning and not about the human race flourishing. And what we need is wisdom and not technical expertise.
Yeah, so if I can interject. So I want to push us a little bit about thinking about these categories through which we are describing the two clips, right? Yumi, I thought what you said was very well said, that one shows the real experience and the other is following sort of logic and script, right? Very systematically. But many of you have described the first one as emotional and making us feel emotional, and the second one as detached and rational and authoritative. So I want us to sort of think about how we are sort of reproducing certain taken for granted assumptions about what makes something emotional. And usually when it's emotional, it becomes then easier to not take seriously as a form of expertise versus something seem reasoned and rational, right? So is it the case that the first one is not rational? And is it the case that the second one was also not emotional? Right? Do you see what I'm saying? Right? Are there ways of saying that maybe we need to rethink what rationality means to us? If talking about nuclear weapons in this cold, detached way is rational, right? And Carol Cohn, whose article was the basis of the next question we did not discuss, says actually the world of defense intellectuals who use this very detached, rational language is actually very much suffused with emotion. You know, there's all kinds of emotions. It's just different kinds. It's playful. There's all kinds of sexual imagery, right? But it doesn't appear emotional in the way that first clip did. So I'm wondering sort of if this is a provocation to help to really sort of start thinking about those concepts of rationality and emotionality differently rather than take those for granted.
I think both clips have a different provocation. So the first clip is more about a call of action to prevention, which David is talking about in the chat, whereas the second clip is a call to action to raise your stockpile and kind of continue to build your arsenal. So David said, clip one gets my heart and then my mind focused on how do we prevent this kind of catastrophe. And clip two does not provide any solutions. We need wisdom on how to prevent.
Yeah, I wonder if this category of wisdom kind of captures a little bit of a different way of thinking about the different experiences of these clips, because I see what you're saying, that Shampa, it's like by evacuating all of this pain from the way the defense intellectuals, the way this expert discourse that we prepare students for by teaching them a certain history of deterrence that doesn't engage with the effects of nuclear attacks, of the production of nuclear arsenals and so forth and so on. You sort of prepare them for entrance into a world where there is a pleasure in the actual kind of banter of back and forth as you debate these things, right? That in and of itself is something that can be fun. I mean, and enjoyable. It's something that can be attractive. Also, competition can be attractive, right? So to think of it as not emotional is maybe not is inaccurate.
David continues to say expertise is needed. That's legal, effective, and enforceable rule of law and reform global system to prevent, protect, and remedy. So I think that kind of bridges the gap, because the first clip is a call to action to prevention, and in the second clip, they have military authority to do so. And Fernando says, to me, the male clip sounds like someone who I could not ask him any questions to without sounding dumb or being easily dismissed. Part of why it sounds authoritative is because it conveys a sense of not being something that could be challenged.
Yeah, I think that's right on what Fernando says there at the end. It becomes, I mean, that this is one way that the nuclear field becomes so hard to like it's a world of its own. It talks this language of technical jargon where expertise definitely means being able to talk in certain ways, right? I mean, it's a world full of acronyms and right, and you have to sort of follow. And I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier too. The ability to follow a certain kind of script well, right? And so it is hard to. Carol Cohn says it's a language of its own. It's a different language, right? So to try to speak a different language to these group of experts really makes you sound dumb, right? And she says, in this world, peace does not have, for instance, there's no place for the word peace. You cannot use the word peace without sounding stupid, right? So we need to think about not just what this kind of language permits, but also what it excludes by the way it's structured, like who it allows entry to and who it excludes.
It occurs to me also that there may be people who would also find it difficult to respond to the first clip, right? Like there is a force of that experience, which is so profound that it may silence many people, because knowing how to respond to something that is painful and horrific on that level is actually a difficult thing to hold the space for. And it in and of itself takes a different kind of expertise and kind of a practice. And we don't, as a community, do that kind of work to produce scripts. I mean, I feel like when Misako says, I've listened to this clip many times, Misako does this work, right? You know, so there are places where it happens, and I think it's also very characterized by where you're located within the community. But I would, you know, one of the things, it occurs to me that both of these are silencing, but maybe in different ways.
Yeah. I think that what both Anne and Shampa said is very important, because this is really why the real conversation is not really happening between nuclear abolitionists and like a deterrence believers, and they are not really listening. They are speaking two different languages. Sometimes people said they live in two parallel universe. That's a really ongoing issues, but it's really important to bring these two seemingly completely different camp closer to have a real conversation dialogue. That's what I always hoping. I believe Anne and I had this kind of talk almost 10 years ago while you were in Monterey. So
I feel like we might want to wrap the conversation up a little bit and maybe move on if people want to talk about the larger project and so forth. But I think that this exercise gives you a sense of what pedagogically we're hoping to achieve with this project, which is bringing in different voices that aren't always heard in expert communities, trying to create different types of dialogue. And also there is a pedagogical decision that is around how do you interpret the idea that decolonizing a curriculum is about using different methods, right? So one of the things that these exercises that, and I think that I'll be honest about like the breadth of them. I think that the feminist group, the people who created them, took on this particular aspect of it very well, which is the notion of a decolonizing pedagogy as in some ways not using an expert register that is taking cognitive information and giving it to people to read, you know, through a text or so forth, but one that uses multiple senses, right? So one of the things that I like about this exercise so much is precisely that it does use listening as one of your senses, and you don't always get that in that way, you know, in academia. You get it as someone talking at you in a lecture format frequently, but this piece of asking someone to participate in a kind of reflexive epistemological experience as they build knowledge is a different type of approach to teaching. And the idea that you can put things together that live online that do this through, like Shampa talked about, aesthetically trying to communicate something about the lens or the approach through how the different graphics I create a visual language or kind of landscape and backdrop for the other exercises and information was one aspect. Having things that use different types of either tactile or listening exercises is another. And this was, when we started this, I don't know, Shampa, you can chime in, but I felt like I didn't really know how to interpret it, what a decolonizing pedagogy would look like, right? As opposed to the sort of larger notion of the project of decolonization as bringing in marginalized voices and perspectives. I understood what that looked like in my own mind topically, but not pedagogically. And so just to sort of like wrap up, I think this discussion, at least for me, demonstrates the power of this kind of approach.
Yeah, and I just want to add that these resources are all available for free on the website. So if any of you want to use any of these for teaching, educating others, maybe even have a conversation with your family members or friends, you are welcome to do so. So you can pick bits and pieces, you can pick whole modules, whatever works for your purposes. But we really do want to encourage people to use them. Give us feedback. We want to keep working on this over the long term, if you're able to.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a really excellent educational resources. So I'm so glad that we have educators and some students. I think we have just a little bit of more time, and I'm wondering if anyone has any questions related to decolonizing nuclear studies or just general questions. Please feel free to ask. Okay, so any question? David, you wanna ask a question?
Yeah, my question would be certainly in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, where we've had now 3 nuclear peace summits of high school students. We've really learned that very important to have very active student engagement in them having really seen the huge catastrophic negative impacts, how they can think about this, how they can talk about it, and most importantly, how they can act in their own individual lives to prevent this human-caused threat and risk to human existence and thriving to change. And I think I can even remember back as a kid in class in the duck and cover days where one would ask oneself is, how did the world ever let this happen? And I know going way back, I became committed to contribute to a more just, moral universe where these kinds of human-caused weapons were never allowed to exist or ever be utilized. So that's where I come from: student, interactive, creative ownership of and responsibility for what they can do with guidance from the teacher as to all of their kinds of options. And that's where the so-called experts come in. And the experts that are most needed are philosophers and wise people, not the technical experts.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges in front of us, is how to engage young people into the nuclear question. And I don't think it's easy. I live amongst young people, and I will be honest that my students are very active politically. They're very energized. But they are not thinking about nuclear weapons. They're thinking about climate change, which as they should. They're thinking about student debt. They're thinking about racism and rising authoritarianism. They're rarely thinking about nuclear weapons. And that despite the fact that we live about 60 miles downwind from Hanford, which is now the most contaminated site in the Northern Hemisphere. And in a state, in Washington State, which if it was a country would be the third largest holder of nuclear weapons. Washington State has a lot of nuclear weapons, but our students are not thinking about nuclear weapons. So for me, what I try to do is connect nuclear weapons issues with the issues that they are interested in. So I think we have to meet young people where they are. Climate change is connected with nuclear weapons. Race and racism and colonialism is very much affected with nuclear weapons production and use, right? Their student debt, the fact that we spend so much on nuclear weapons is less money to spend on. There's an opportunity cost there, right? Less money to spend on their futures in education and health and in the kinds of things that they are really heavily invested in. So for me, I think that's how we make the connection. I mean, we are in this moment. I think the Oppenheimer film has instigated some interest, and there are some conversations that are happening around nuclear weapons. The New York Times just started doing this interactive series on nuclear weapons, in part to sort of start, initiating people thinking about young people thinking about nuclear weapons. But I think you're absolutely right. That's where our focus should be. And both Anne and I are both educators, which is why we thought this is where we have to find ways of engaging young people in the nuclear question.
Great, thank you. So speaking of young people, are there any questions from, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but any question from Japan?
Yes, there is a question. It says from Kansai Soka High School.
Oh, great. Please.
Hello, thank you for today's lecture, and I'm Hinamiki from Kansai Soka High School in Japan. And actually, my question is not really related to today's discussion, but I thought that especially Dr. Harrington is in the the Department of Politics and Politics and International Relations. So yeah, and my question is I've heard that some people says that the first step for nuclear abolition is America's nuclear weapons reduction. And I would like to ask your opinion, because I don't really agree with that, because even though America abolished their nuclear weapons, other countries I think don't do so. So I would like to ask your opinion.
I would say that's a very challenging question, and it goes really right to the heart of this issue of if you go back historically, right, back to when they first through the United Nations tried to create some sort of treaty or agreement that would abolish nuclear weapons, the question it stumbled on in part was who would go first, right? The US or the Soviet Union, right? So this question of if you were going to create some sort of if you were going to create some sort of agreement that kind of sequenced nuclear abolition in some way, what would that look like? One of the things that I think there's a couple of pieces that before you can get there, one is that there needs to be better investment in and acknowledgement of the international structures that are like the International Atomic Energy Agency that are there to create the conditions that would make the idea of what you're touching on of, well, how do we know once everyone gets rid of their nuclear weapons, how do we know if they're going to create them again? Or how do we know that everyone actually is going to get rid of their weapons, right? This is why funding and supporting these international bodies whose job it is to do that kind of monitoring is so important. And also just teaching people that these things exist, right? So I once had this experience where I was working for a senator on Capitol Hill, and in the evening I was teaching at George Mason University. And in the master's program, I would have the staffers who are working for the senators in the US Congress. And there was one who was from this far right-wing, very, very conservative senator. And he was advising, you know, he's in his 20s, he's advising this senator on the senator's nuclear policy. And this young man, he didn't know that there was something called the International Atomic Energy Agency. He didn't know that there were inspections. He didn't know that any of the architecture and detection devices that are out there exist. And so he is giving advice to the senator based on a vacuum of information, based only on the information he has about deterrence and about nuclear deterrence and not about other things. So it starts with investing in those things. And also, I think, investing in a kind of cultural project of making it strange that we think nuclear weapons create security. Right? Like, I think a lot of people who advocate for disarmament already experience this as strange, right? Like, I find it very odd that we make all these very dangerous things and then we think this makes us secure. And I don't really know what that project looks like. You know, we have examples of things that do that work for us, but it's something that needs to be constantly repeated in some way. But your question goes right to the heart of everything we care about. So it's a really excellent question, and thank you so much for answering it. Asking it.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we are running out of time, but I really appreciate both Anne and Shampa for these extremely timely and important lectures.